Hey, deserving listeners, we're finally hearing from Amber Heard's forensic psychologist, so let's find out what she says. I'm going to react to it. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Let's see what happens.
I also did teaching and training for Victim Services, which is New York City's largest.
Dr. Dawn Hughes is laying out her experience. She has extensive experience working with intimate partner violence victims and perpetrators, also with substance abuse and with PTSD and trauma. She is laying out a very impressive resume that is perfectly suited for this case.
I'm also called upon to sort of troubleshoot difficult scenarios that clinicians, either training.
So not only is she a forensic psychologist that conducts these assessments for court and other legal purposes, but she also is a clinical psychologist in that she provides clinical services, psychotherapy, this kind of thing. And she also supervises.
That was a recent presentation. I think that was invited by one of the...
She's talking about giving training. She's talking about publishing chapters. I'm guessing to highlight not only her expertise, but also to contrast this with Dr. Curry, because either Dr. Curry didn't have this amount in her resume or they just didn't ask.
I was the APA Council of Representatives, which...
Now I think she's a workaholic, because I can't imagine doing all that she is now rattling off. I mean, the amount of things that she is involved in. I mean, she is president-elect of the Trauma Division in APA, which is a sought-after position, and you really have to know your stuff and be networking a lot and also be dedicated to the work, be known for your work.
What coercive control does is that it imposes negative consequences for noncompliance with your partner's expectations or demands. And what that does is it erodes away at the victim's autonomy and her independence.
Just more resume building, which is impressive to see. I mean, I'm wondering if there's anyone more qualified for this job than she is. But I was paying attention to a few questions. One question was, essentially, has anyone ever hired you to find PTSD, but you didn't find it? That wasn't the exact question, but I think that was the implication. And Dr. Hughes said, yeah, frequently, meaning that I'm not a biased evaluator, I think is the implication there. I also was listening if there was any kind of gender bias, because I will tell you that in my interactions with other colleagues, I can sometimes see bias regarding gender. We all have a bias about gender. I have a bias about gender. We can't get away from that. We live in a gender-biased society as clinicians and researchers, and we can't get out of that. We just live in it. We were raised in it. We are it. We have to constantly check in with it. So I was waiting for some kind of indication, because she is the Amber Heard forensic psychologist, and we've heard some, pretty compelling evidence against Amber Heard. Of course, Amber Heard's team hasn't had a chance to present their findings. And by the way, just to give you an idea of where I am in the timeline, I watched Dr. Curry only. I didn't watch anything else in the trial. Then I went back to day 1 of the trial and started watching that. And then I think on day 3 or 4, and then everyone started emailing me, say, you got to watch Dr. Hughes. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like the best bit. So now I'm watching that. So I haven't watched most, I've seen a little bit of it, but I eventually will, and I'll post all of it. So she did just say, and we're going to rewind this, that she referred to the victim as a woman, which I don't know what that says. Could have been a slip of the tongue. Maybe it was a conscious choice.
What coercive control does is that it imposes negative consequences for noncompliance with your partner's expectations or demands. And what that does is it erodes away at the victim's autonomy and her independence.
At the victim's autonomy and her independence. What does that mean? Nothing, really. But if I had a trainee that said that, I'd be like, whoa, did you notice you just said that? Like, I would absolutely call them out on that. Most of the time, in a heterosexual relationship, the victim is the woman. Yeah, most of the time. And it might even be vast majority of the time. But that doesn't mean all the time. And we have a problem in our society about denying all victims, but particularly men victims. So we want to be very careful when we're labeling victims and perpetrators based on men are always the perpetrators and women are always the victims. So, but I don't know what that means. Just an observation. And of course she knows that. She's a super expert on this topic. So I'm sure if she were sitting here, she'd be like, yeah, of course I know that.
Yes, very much so. This is very well documented in the literature about violence and abuse in relationships, and that's just physics. That's just proportional force. That if a 185-pound man is going to push a 120-pound woman, that's going to feel quite different than a 120-pound woman pushing a 185-pound man. And it's just about proportional force and the size and strength differential. And that is why specifically, if you look at wrestling or boxing, they match weight classes.
Yeah, all this is true. If I were asked this question, I would answer it similarly. But at the end, I would have an asterisk that says, but that by no means that people who are smaller cannot abuse people who are bigger, because there are many documented cases of that. In fact, research shows, I believe, so don't quote me on this, that if someone is being abused by someone that's physically smaller than them, they don't often even recognize that it's abuse, because we have this notion in our society that you can't be abused, you can't be experiencing domestic violence from someone who is physically smaller than you and weaker than you. But I'm telling you, it happens. And if you can't imagine it, I mean, I get it, because it's almost never, if ever, depicted, but it can be physical. There's also threats you can make to someone, like I'm going to kill your cats, or I'm going to tell the world that you're an abusive person. There's a wide variety of ways that you can abuse someone, even if they can physically defend themselves from you. So I would have that asterisk, but everything she's saying is absolutely true. It's very important when we understand domestic violence and partner violence that size is a factor, that when you have someone that's bigger significantly and they're both making threats and they're both pushing or shoving, that the bigger person has to be more aware of their strength and the size differential.
So stalking and surveillance behaviors are a common tactic of typically men who use violent behaviors in an intimate relationship. What they do is they allow the woman to know that wherever she is.
So if I were on the jury and I heard this, I would wonder if she's biased. I don't know if she's biased, of course, but I would wonder. If I was her, if I was Dr. Hughes, I would really try to avoid giving any hint or indication that you were biased regarding gender and intimate partner violence, but she just did it again. You saw her, she's like, typically men, so essentially she gave a little indication that some women will stalk, because they absolutely do stalk. By the way, I won't go down that road, but let's just say I have personal experience. Now, it is typically men. It's hard to gauge this in terms of like percentages, though, because when you are trying to gather the prevalence of this in general, and then you're trying to break it out by gender, you're relying on people reporting. So it's really hard to know, because if the reporting of men is very down regarding being a victim of stalking, then the data is going to be off. We wouldn't do this in other situations, right? Like if, for example, in Seattle, the typical human being is a white person. I think it's like 2/3 white in Seattle. So I wouldn't say, since it's typical that the Seattleite is white, I'm just going to refer to all Seattleites as white. So let's just go with that. And I've heard people do this. I have colleagues who do. It's kind of, I feel like I haven't seen that in a while. I feel like in the past 10 years, colleagues who will speak this way don't do that. They'll very quickly catch themselves. But previous to 10 years ago, I almost always heard language like this. And, I was a novice therapist or professor, and I just said, oh, okay, that's what we're supposed to do. And then over time, I was like, well, why are we doing that? Like, is that just the way we're supposed to, like, the perpetrator's always a man and the victim's always a woman? Why are we? A similar thing in early psychotherapy was true, that the psychoanalyst was referred to as male and the patient was referred to as female, even though it wasn't always the case. But authors didn't want to say he or she, and so it was just understood in the clinical literature that if you were saying he, that was referring to the therapist, and you're saying she, that refers to the client. And when you read that language, you just think, that doesn't look right. Why are you always referring? Another gender weirdness in the clinical literature in the past was they would always refer to the parent as she and the child as he. That one's less bothersome to me, but it's still Well, actually, it was reflective of the times, right? Because in the 50s, it was predominantly, but of course, there were men who were the primary caregivers, and certainly fathers were involved in raising children, to some extent. So that kind of thing has always kind of bothered me. And so if I were her, I would really try to steer clear of that, particularly in this case, because the issue, unless she finds that Amber Heard is not a victim, which I'm just going to take a guess since she's hired by the Amber Heard team, that's not going to be the case. Not to say that she's lying or biased. Actually, a lawyer listener emailed in and said that that's true. He's a trial lawyer for 20 years, and he confirmed that. That was just my anecdotal experience, having been in a lot of these kinds of trials.
Wherever she goes, he's going to know. I'm going to maybe look at your phone, see who you're talking to, track you on Find My iPhone, look at your Instagram, look at your emails, really having a way of knowing all of the personal information about you. And what that does, it again erodes the victim's autonomy and it erodes her sense of privacy. She doesn't feel that wherever she can go, that somewhere he's not going to be.
Yeah, you can't not hear it now, right? Now, this doesn't invalidate her findings. It doesn't mean that she doesn't know what she's talking about. She clearly knows what she's talking about.
Part of her life in a very objectionable way. Sometimes there's the pop-ins. They'll show up at places that they're not supposed to be and that we don't want them to be, just as a way of checking. Sometimes they'll have friends or family check up on their partners to make sure where they are. What time did you get home? But you didn't turn off your phone at this time, but you came in the door this time. Like all of the sort of constant questioning and interrogation about an individual's whereabouts.
She's describing stalking really well. She clearly has experience with it. It's not talked about enough because I think in our culture, we think that stalking is like the extreme end, but people can stalk and intimidate this way in very, very subtle ways by what she's talking about. Just like, hey, like if, I don't know if they're going to find this, but if Johnny Depp called Amber Heard's sister and was just like, hey, I'm just calling to see what's going on with your sister, Amber, that kind of behavior on the surface, you'd think, well, it's just someone checking in on someone. What's wrong with that? But if it's understood and it's meant to communicate to the victim, I'm watching you, I know where you are, I have contact with people in your life, and I can harm you.
So possessive jealousy is a very difficult dynamic in intimate partner violence. It's very common in situations of coercive control. It's rooted in possession, that the gentleman feels that he can possess her and that he can have her whenever he wants.
Maybe this is a tactic to try to influence the jury into picturing Amber in the victim role. Now, of course, we live in a misogynistic, sexist culture, and the manosphere that are trying to deny sexism in our culture will often say, but women are perpetrators too, and they often will bring that up as some sort of discounting data point that somehow eliminates the option of women and academics, regardless of gender, claiming that sexism and misogyny is in our culture. You know what I mean? Like people, like sometimes when people are trying to deny racism against black people, they will say, well, I once heard a black person being racist to a white person. It's often brought up in that context. They're just trying to level the playing field as if somehow it is level, which of course it isn't regarding race or gender. So I want to be clear, I'm not saying anything along those lines. I'm just pointing out that men are victims of these. They're of these sorts of abuses, less so of a rate, but we're talking about thousands, perhaps millions of men in the United States who are or have experienced this sort of abuse, and to just deny them by labeling all victims as women is, and of course, we have non-binary people as well who can be victims and perpetrators. The first time I heard her genderize victims, I thought, oh, she just did a slip. She's certainly, because I think that was the first time. I thought for sure she's not going to do that again, but now she's really just laying into it.
But the accusations, the problem is when you make the accusations, the woman's forced to refute the accusations. So they're continuing in this dynamic where she's trying to prove, I didn't do what you said, this didn't happen. And then, unfortunately, sometimes it escalates because the man is not taking the no for an answer because this is a perseverative, obsessive pattern.
And just imagine if you do identify as a man and you have experienced something that you thought, well, was that abuse? Was that coercive control? I don't know. And let's say that it was. And you hear this super expert talking about how all victims are women. She didn't say that explicitly, but I could imagine someone inferring that from the way she's talking. Of course, we don't want to do that, right? We just say people. And so then all victims can feel potentially invited into validation.
And then it gets the woman hooked. So they get hooked on the kindness. They get hooked on the love. They don't get hooked on the abuse. I've never met one woman in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that I've evaluated who was not concerned about the violence.
So, I mean, it's just me going on and on about this, I skipped forward. There was a number of other instances of genderizing the perpetrator and the victim. Well, so I'll give her absolute kudos for describing trauma bonding correctly, which of course she would because she understands that fully. And she describes love bombing well as well. But as you know from my lectures on love bombing and having treated love bombers of various different kinds, of various genders, by the way. In fact, when I have given talks and podcasts about love bombing, all the people that reach out to me and say, I was a love bomber, identified as women. So it's not as if love bombing is a male thing. And I don't know if do people think of it that? Maybe they do. I don't know. But the love bombing in a psychopathic abusive relationship is often very volitional and purposeful, and the perpetrator knows what they're doing. They know they're tricking someone. They know they're sucking someone in. Or love bombing in a cult, for example, that abuses their members, can sometimes often also be very volitional. They might not call it love bombing, but they know that they are lying to someone, deceiving them into believing that the leaders or the abusive person is in love and has very high positive regard for the other person. In the back of their mind, they're like, well, eventually I'm going to pull back on this because I don't want to do this I'm just trying to suck them in. But the perpetrators and the love bombers, I've certainly treated people like that, but more often, anecdotally, the individual is doing it out of their awareness. They're love bombing because they're so desperate for closeness that they actually feel desperate for proximity with the person emotionally and physically, and they often will feel very much in love with the target, only to later be triggered and then to abuse the target. So it usually comes from someone that is absolutely capable of empathy, but they're so desperate.
The rationalizations and the justifications for the behavior. It's not like typically the man is taking full responsibility for what he did, but it's calm because there's no, violence and no sort of tension at that moment. And then it recurs. So you're stuck in this vicious cycle of trying to figure out how can I be with this man who hurt.
Yeah, I mean, if it weren't for the genderizing, she is explaining a lot of aspects of intimate partner violence well in the relationship. She's describing the cycle of domestic violence, the cycle of intimate partner violence really well right now. And I'm guessing this, one, helps the jury believe that she knows what she's talking about compared to Dr. Curry, because Dr. Curry didn't have any kinds of lectures like this to the jury, and I don't think even had specific expertise in it, aside from just regular clinical work, which I'm sure she does to some extent, but not as much as Dr. Hughes does. So it helps that, but I think it's also they're setting up data that they're going to present that will slot into all these concepts of stalking and emotional abuse, and I think it sounds like there's going to be allegations of sexual abuse and assault from Johnny Depp to Amber Heard.
It could be sending flowers and buying gifts or going on trips or your favorite restaurant. And that is, a way of where the man is trying to make those amends. And then it gets the woman hooked. So they get hooked on the kindness. They get hooked on the love. They don't get hooked on the abuse. I've never met one woman in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that I've evaluated who was not concerned about the violence.
I mean, hundreds and hundreds. I've never met a woman in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of evaluations that I've conducted. So referring to all the victims. Now, it's possible that she's literally never treated a male victim of intimate partner violence because the clinic doesn't attract those kinds of people. Maybe she doesn't specialize in that. Okay, your experience is your experience. Sometimes that just happens. But to refer to all victims, I just keep saying it, And I want to be clear, we have a problem of denying all victims their voice, regardless of gender. We just do less of that devoicing to women. There's a lot of devoicing to women in general, regardless of what they want to say, but the devoicing to men victims, male victims of domestic violence and all the other phenomena that she's describing is profound, and we have a big problem with that. In fact, there's this clip that I saw on Reddit recently where this male victim was on an Oprah show in the UK, I believe, and he was describing being hit by his girlfriend or wife, and the audience laughed. They just half the audience, that's so funny that she hit you. And the host, the person in the Oprah role, turns to the audience and said, wait, why did everyone just laugh at that? And I was like, oh, good. And he essentially chastised the audience for laughing about someone experiencing intimate partner violence. The way the victim was describing it was not as if he was making a joke. I'm not saying anything y'all don't know, but I don't know. I'll stop reacting to that.
So mutual abuse isn't really a term of art that we use. What we look at is situational couple violence and intimate partner violence. And when we look at situational couple violence, that really does characterize the majority of types of violence and abuse that happens in relationships. That's when a couple gets out of hand, they may push, shove, slap.
So I'm sure she's going to get into this because she's a super expert. But just to put it in my words, that situational violence is when there is violence between an intimate relationship, but you wouldn't characterize it as intimate partner violence or abuse because the violence doesn't have a coercive control element to it. And it's not good that this would happen, but I'll give an example. So say that, let's reverse the genders just to balance it out. Okay. Let's say that you have a couple, heterosexual couple, and there isn't a power dynamic and there isn't dominance and there isn't coercive control in the relationship, but a heterosexual couple goes to a bar and the husband starts to flirt with a woman, the wife starts to talk with her friends, and then the husband goes into the bathroom and starts to fool around with this random woman that he met at a bar. The wife hears a rumor about it, goes into the bathroom, and proceeds to be violent with the two of them. So the wife is upset, she's intoxicated. Obviously, it's quite a shock to see her husband getting together with someone else, and there's some violence there. And then the next day, everyone wakes up, and the husband doesn't feel as if he is under the wife's thumb or that process isn't beginning. So in that situation, we might call it situational violence. Again, it's not good. There are other ways to solve our problems, and a lot of really horrible crimes can happen in this category, but it's not part of an overall pattern of dominance and control.
Yell, say some things that they don't want, and it's not that those behaviors are okay, but those are sort of what our larger scale community-based studies say happens in these relationships. That's distinguished from intimate partner violence, what I'm talking to you about, that has this constellation of symptoms and is rooted in the abuse of power and control.
Right. So she said, this doesn't make it okay, because somehow when you differentiate these two, I often find that people are saying, so it's okay to do that? It's like, no, they're both horrible, but one is involved in a larger pattern, and that's always important.
Yeah, there's research that addresses what does gender symmetry look like, male and female. Are they the same? And there's certainly, as I said, research that on the lower end types of violent behaviors, push, shove, slap, we may see similar rates between men and women. In psychological aggression, yelling, name calling, putting down, in some of our big community scale studies, we may see similar rates of perpetration.
Okay, so good, great. I'm glad that this was asked. I'm glad she's saying that. I'm not familiar with this research. That does ring a bell. that with a low degree violence like pushing, shoving, the rates are similar among gender. And again, in these research studies, they almost never research non-binary people or even differentiate between trans or other. So we're in the dark ages in psychology when it comes to gender and research. It's really a problem. So I apologize to my non-binary and trans watchers and listeners right now. So, I've been doing my part to raise awareness. I've been trying to, like in my research study, I actually did differentiate all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so she's saying that low-grade violence is similar rates between men and women, and then psychological abuse, similar rates between men and women.
But then there are, other situations where we don't have gender symmetry. And what the research talks about very clearly is you have to examine context.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm guessing they're setting this all up to contextualize if Amber was being violent, that it could be from a place that a victim is trying to defend themselves. In fact, I don't know if I've talked about this. I don't think I have in this series, but we just recently watched The Ultimatum, which is a reality show on Netflix. I gave my reaction. In fact, I don't think this video has come out yet, but I want to say this because people have been emailing me about it, that Zay is a male and Ray is a woman, and they were in a relationship. They were in a conflict, and Ray wanted to leave, and he prevented her physically from leaving the apartment. And this is all caught on camera. In a camera in the corner, it's not like the film crew was there. So I was wondering even if they remembered the camera was there, but they showed us this scene where he was chasing her and she was trying to get away, and she repeatedly said, "Don't touch me, get away from me, get off me, let me go, let me leave, get out of here," and she's moving away. And it lasted a long time. It was really disturbing to watch, actually. And it's absolutely abusive to do that. You cannot do that. If someone wants to leave their apartment, you have to let them go. And I think it's actually illegal to prevent someone from leaving their own house, especially when you're just trying to control them. Now, you might think if you're doing that, I'm just trying to talk with them. It's like, okay, fine, you're trying to talk, but you can't imprison someone, And then at the end of that, she says to him, if you don't leave me alone, and if you don't get your hands off of me, I'm going to punch you like I did before. And she didn't even say it that strongly. She was like rattled. And then they cut to black. And then later on, they refer to the fact that she had punched him. And then the whole storyline was how she was abusive. And I read a lot of people commenting how horrible Ray was. And I'm like, did you not see the scene? She was defending herself. She was being abused. She was being imprisoned. She repeatedly, over no joke, maybe a couple of minutes, was like constantly, "Let go of me, leave me alone. Let go of me, leave me alone. Let go of me, leave me alone. Let me leave the place." Da 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 da. And then even warned him, "If you don't stop touching me, I'm going to hit you." That's not abuse. That's defending yourself. Okay, so I think what they're going to try to demonstrate is that that's where Amber Heard's violence came from. So I'm curious as to what sort of data they can present around that.
You have to examine the differential of power and control and coercive control in the relationship to make a full determination.
Right. So you're trying to essentially get into their heads, because looking at a relationship from the outside, it's hard to know if someone feels controlled and intimidated. And that's where I like my slice of the profession, where I don't have to make these kinds of decisions. I started doing work as a forensic psychologist and quickly found that there were multiple elements of it that I didn't like. God bless everyone that does it. Someone's got to do it, and it could pay a lot of money, but it just wasn't for me. And as a therapist, I'm free. I don't have to make a public opinion. I don't have to go on record and state this or that. I can listen to clients tell me what's happening, and plus they trust me because I'm not out to get them. In fact, I often will tell people if they're in a court, if they're in some sort of court involvement, I will explicitly tell them, in order to get me to testify on your behalf or anything to get involved in your court case, you will have to get me. I will resist every attempt in order for you to get me to testify in court for this legal proceeding you're involved in. You will have to subpoena me, and I will not go willingly, because I want to be your therapist. I don't want to be your evaluator. I don't want to be involved in that. I care about you and I wish you the best, but there are other professionals that can help you with that they want to do that with their career. I don't want to do that with my career. If by law I have to appear and provide testimony, I will, but I'll tell you, I'm not going to go willingly, and I will give the minimal answer required by me, which will probably not help you. Because if I'm going to really help someone, I need to know what's going on. And in order to know what's going on, I need the honest truth. I need their real experience. And if, for example, someone is in a violent relationship and I'm seeing just one of the individuals, and I say this, that I will go kicking and screaming to court and I'll give minimal information required by me to give, then if they're the perpetrator and they have questions, maybe I'm the perpetrator, they can tell me that and I can actually help them with that.
Do women use violence in relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we've known this for 5 decades in our research. We've been studying this since the 70s. And when we look at what happens, women do report their use of violence. The majority of violence that we do see is what we call reactive violence or self-defensive violence, or sometimes violence that's perpetrated.
I mean, yes, she's not lying. 99% of what she's saying, I'm totally behind. I'm like, yeah, this is great. She's educating the jury. I'm really glad that this is a popular, there's almost 4 million views of this, which is actually incredible that people would watch a trial on YouTube because, it's kind of dry. But, the amount of people that she could literally be saving people's lives by talking about this so well, and so extensively.
Independently of an assault, of something that's going on. But mostly that when the partner begins to become violent, then she may become violent and fight back. And that's not an uncommon dynamic, that if somebody is being pushed or shoved or hit, that a person would fight back. That has been established in the research.
The other thing that Dr. Curry talked about was that she can't evaluate if violence occurred or who was abusive of who, because that's not our role as forensic psychologists. We report on psychological diagnoses. We can't know what happened. We can take people's statements and maybe have a speculation. It would absolutely be speculative, but we understand that perpetrators often lie.
And what, if any, effect does that have on changing the power dynamics or the structure?
Well, you have to find out, does it? Does her use of violence change the overarching power structure of coercive control and violence and abuse in this relationship? And you have to examine those variables to see, does it or does it not?
Can men be victims of intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. Certainly, we know that we have to be careful of gendered stereotypes. We can't go in and think, oh, only the woman is the victim, and only the man is the perpetrator.
You think? I mean, I try not to get sarcastic and annoying, but I feel for male victims. I've treated male victims of all sorts of abuse and stalking and coercive control and mistreatment. So I guess I have a lot of pain around that. So that's why I'm having these reactions. And now she's being explicitly asked, have men been, can men be abused? And so she says, absolutely, we shouldn't stereotype. Well, then why have you been? And I knew she would say that because she's a super expert. Of course, she knows that men can be victims. And of course, she knows she shouldn't stereotype. So why have you been?
That just does not comport with the research. We know that the research also shows that we can have domestic violence in same-sex relationships. My very first case was a same-sex domestic violence homicide in Brooklyn. That was in 1998. So I've been examining and treating individuals in a variety of types of violent contexts.
It's interesting. My first client was 2 years earlier than hers and was also a victim of violence. She was a trans woman, actually. I mean, it's hard to remember from back. She was either my very first client or she was my second client. But my very first client was a trans sex worker, actually, that had been physically harmed, I think that morning, and had made it into my office. And I remember her very clearly.
So we have to be careful that that bias doesn't get in our way when we're evaluating a particular situation in a particular case. That said, we do know that there still are differences. In a heterosexual.
After referring to all victims as women and all perpetrators as men through this entire discussion, never the opposite, by the way, she is asked directly, can men be victims? She says, absolutely, research shows us. However, why do you have to have a however? Now, of course, I'm just going to take a guess and say we're heading into data being presented that clearly shows that Johnny Depp is perpetrator, and maybe I'll be convinced. I don't know. But if she did conclude that Amber Heard is the victim and Johnny Depp is the perpetrator, and there's a lot of data that demonstrates that, and that any violence that Amber Heard committed was only situational and in self-defense, then I would absolutely understand why she would be, as an evaluator and as a staunch advocate for victims for decades, that she would really want to emphasize, look, we don't want to go down a road where we start to think that just because Amber was violent occasionally, that somehow that means that she's the perpetrator, because that isn't the case based on the data that I provided. So I want to really steer away from this, well, women can be abusive too, because I don't want y'all to think that, because that isn't what's happening here, and I will present the data later. So if that's true, okay, but let's hear the data first before you start trying to influence things.
Couple in a male-female dyad, the research still is clear that there are differences. Men still perpetrate more severe acts of violence. Women are still more likely to be injured. They are much more likely to suffer sexual violence at the hands of their partner. They're more likely to be intimidated, afraid, and they're much more likely to be killed.
100%, 100%. If you have a death by a spouse, it's almost always men to women. But you were asked, can men be abused? And this is where you ended up.
And what we say is, how lay people think someone who suffered a traumatic event is supposed to act. So in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, people think, oh, they should be hysterical and abreacting and emotional all over the place. And that's typically not the first reaction of a trauma survivor. The first reaction is, suppression, emotional numbing, emotional constriction.
Exactly. So I think they're asking the expert witness about the myths about how people respond to traumas.
How do I get through this? Women who are beaten, they get up the next morning, they get their kids dressed, they get them to school, they go to work, they do a presentation in their office.
So do men. When victims of abuse wake up in the morning, they get their kids dressed, they go, it's just the people.
They go on with life. The most normal thing that a person does who's experienced trauma is to get up and try to be normal. They're striving for that all the time. So sometimes if you see somebody who is more emotionally constricted, looks maybe stoic, looks like they're not feeling, it doesn't mean that they're not having internal reactions. We say this in the field of clinical psychology all the time. The inside doesn't match the outside.
Yeah, especially if you were in an ongoing abusive relationship in which your emotional expressions might be punished, and thus you learn over time to not show how you're feeling. Potentially, if you were abused growing up, you learned that very well growing up, and then you just adopted that defense as an adult, and thus you might not even know you're distressed, because you might even suppress that even though you are distressed, because it's not safe to even recognize your feelings. That certainly can happen.
So there are 4 dates in person in New York City for a total of about 21 and a half hours. And then I saw her in January 18th, 2021 over Zoom for 3 hours, and then December 27th, 2021 for 4 hours over Zoom.
Okay, so on one hand, she has evaluated Amber Heard for many, many hours over time, so that gives her more data to go off of so that she can draw stronger conclusions. On the other hand, I didn't hear her evaluating Johnny Depp or talking with him. Maybe she did. Since we've been talking about intimate partner violence, if all she is going off of is Amber Heard's account, and I don't know if this happens, but I do know that this happens in child custody cases where you have allegations or questions about whether or not a parent is being abusive to the child. And the way that forensic psychologists will conduct their evaluation is to actually observe the parents with the children. They might go to the home and just say, hey, I want you to just make a meal or play a game or let's go to the park. And in those observations, the forensic psychologist is able to gather data. Now, of course, the individual in question could remain on their best behavior, of course, but at least it's some observational data. I don't know if people do this, but I suppose you could work it into the evaluation if everyone consented that you would actually just observe them having a tense conversation or whatever flashpoint they have as a couple. I suppose if it were me, I would want to watch them talk about something contentious, and I would want to watch over a number of hours even. Like I just sort of sit them in a contained room for 4 hours and just have them talk about conflicts that they've had.
So as I stated, the evaluation consisted of psychological testing, a semi-structured clinical interview with Ms. Hurd, a review of a whole host of documents relative to this case and medical records and psychological records, and then 3 collateral interviews, 2 with her treating therapist, Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, Dr. Connell Cohen, and also with her mom.
Okay, so those are not very helpful collaterals to speak to her other therapists who, if Amber Heard did have a biased point of view, significantly biased. Now, if you're trying to diagnose Amber Heard, then absolutely you don't need to talk to Johnny Depp. You don't need to talk to anyone regarding Johnny Depp because you're just, like Dr. Curry, diagnosing someone. But if you're trying to determine who was actually being abusive,
Just get a full sense of their sort of being before the incident for which they're talking about. Then I do a full intimate partner violence assessment, looking at all those characteristics that I talked to you about earlier to get a sense of the full structure of and the dynamic of this relationship.
So absolutely, there are protocols regarding interviewing victims of intimate partner violence. I've only heard those being used to assist treatment, assessing whether or not someone's a victim or an abuser, the extent of the abuse. Gives you a lay of the land, gives you ideas of what diagnoses are at play. Are they safe? There's a whole litany of different questions and topics that you have to hit on, and these instruments just make sure that you hit on those. For me, I'm not usually pressured for time, and so I am able to just think off the top of my head and get to all those topics, in the order that makes sense to me. Safety being number one priority.